we're going to work on Azure Storage Services. So we will learn, Azure Storage accounts, how it actually relates to the different services that are available. And we're also going to learn about the different types of services, storage services, the storage tiers, the redundancy options, and how it actually is driven with the entire architecture or infrastructure of Azure. So as you see on the left, when we talk of storage, what are you storing? You're pretty much storing data, right? So it depends on the type of data. In some cases, you will use the infrastructure as a service, just store it on the virtual machine in the form of a database, maybe SQL Server, MySQL, PostgreSQL, and so on and so forth. Or you could use platform as a service. Platform as a service means it's managed, right? You're actually getting that management being done for you on Azure. So in this case, you have SQL databases, which are relational. You can use table storage, which uses key value pairs, or you can use a blob storage, which we'll talk about shortly. So what are some of the goals that we need to achieve today? Today, we want to be able to describe the storage account options and the storage types, talk about how the redundancy helps us out, and also compare the storage services. We'll also look at storage tiers and how you can move files from one location to another, maybe from on-premises to the cloud, or from one location in the cloud to the other. We'll also talk about how you can migrate data around. All right, so without much ado, let's jump in and get started. What is an Azure Storage account? So before we even talk about the service, before you can store data on the cloud, you need to create a storage account. Okay, so to create a storage account, what do you need? You need to create a name for it. Just like, let's say, an email address. Your email address has to have a unique name. A storage account has to have a unique name. This name is able to be accessed anywhere on the internet. Okay, it can be accessed anywhere on the internet, but again, remember, it's being stored on the cloud. Being stored on the cloud means you get all these advantages or benefits of the cloud, as we mentioned from the onset. So these are words you get to hear often, very frequently, and you get used to them naturally. Let me see if I can find, oh, it's not there. Let me see if I can find my annotator so I can annotate what we need to see here. All right, there you go. Awesome. So what are some of those terms? We're talking about security, right? Your data is always going to be secure. It's going to be always highly available. It's going to be durable, meaning it's going to be always there. If the power goes on and comes back off, or goes off and comes back on, you still have your data. And it's also scalable. If you're running out of space, you can increase the number, you can reduce the number, and so on and so forth. But then there are three different types of or not three, sorry, there are four different types of account storage, and it actually depends on the type of service that you're using. Okay, so the first is the general purpose. Okay, general purpose v2 is a version 2 per se, because that was the first version. So this, in this case, is everything, pretty much everything can be stored in this case. So you can store account types for blobs, file shares, queues, tables, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, in this case, an account type is different from a service. All right, so for instance, let's see if you have I think it would be better if I use an example when we talk about each one of these services. But again, when you want to create a service, you need to determine the account. So the account type, again, four major types: general purpose for whatever you want to use. If you need to store maybe premium storage account types for blocks, if you need to store blocks, say high transaction rates, if they're going to be transactions that are going to be very frequent, and you want very low latency, then you should use the block blobs. I know it sounds like a mouthful, but you're looking at block type of accounts. The other two accounts are unique for Azure Files. So this is just premium files shares. If it's just a page, then you want premium page blobs. All right. I don't want us to worry about the middle column. We'll talk about it next, because it has to do with the redundancy options. What is redundancy? Redundancy is just making sure that your data is backed up somewhere, that there's a copy of your data somewhere. So there are 6 different types of redundancies. What I need you to remember is just that it's based on either in one region or in multiple regions. You see that clearly shortly. So at the end of the day, the main thing to remember at this page is that Azure storage accounts are of 4 different types: your general purpose, which includes all the different services. You have your blobs, which is just for blob storage. You have the one just for file storage, which is file shares. You have the one just for page blobs, which is page premium page blobs. All right. So again, 6 different types of redundancy options. We'll talk about them later on. Now that we've talked about the accounts, in order for you to save something on the cloud, you need to create an account. It's different from your subscription. You create a storage account and then you proceed to create your storage. So let's go ahead here. There you go. So next thing is account endpoints. An endpoint, again, we talked about endpoints yesterday. Think about an endpoint like a door. If you have a website, the endpoint for your website is the link that takes you to that website. That's a link to the door. If you have a picture, the endpoint for that picture is the link that takes you to that picture on the website. Okay. If you have an email address, if you have an email, the endpoint to that email will be your email address. If I send an email to that email address, that's the only way I can get to you. So the storage, whatever you're storing on the cloud, will also need an endpoint. The endpoint is usually unique. It has a unique name, and it has to be unique in the entire Azure space. So if I have an endpoint that says ABC, nobody else can have that endpoint that says ABC. So in order for you to have a storage account endpoint, it's usually generated by a combination of your account name, remember that storage account, and also the service endpoint, depending on the service. Now we're going to talk about the services shortly, but here are the different types of storage services. If you have a storage blob or an Azure file or a data lake or a queue or a table. So each one of these has a particular name that shows up, okay? So if you look closely at the first one, it usually ends with blob.core.windows.net. That is the particular service endpoint. So when you create your account, your storage account, to get the endpoint, to get to that blob storage, it has to be the name of your storage account, .blob.core.windows.net. The rest of them have the same annotation or nomenclature. You also have DFS for data lake storage. You have file for Azure Files. You have queue for queue storage, and you have table for table storage. The only thing that's going to be unique or change in this case would be your account name. So that's why you have to have a unique namespace, and unique not only for your Azure account, but for the entire Azure ecosystem. Now, when you create these names, there are certain rules, just like your email, just like any other file name and so on. It has to be unique within Azure, as we pointed out. It should have at least 3 letters. It cannot be more than 24 letters. And it contains numbers and lowercase letters only. So you're not going to have uppercase, lowercase, and so on. All right. So again, this will all make sense when we actually start creating storage. Now let's take a look at redundancy. I talked about those 6 different redundancies, and I told you not to worry about it. But now let's talk about it. Remember, we talked about a couple sessions ago, the different types of physical infrastructure. The first was your data center. Within a data center, you can have availability zones within it. And your data center is usually in a region. So redundancy is usually based on 2 things. It's either in the primary region, within the primary region, or you can have redundancy across regions, okay? So let's talk about the first example, which is just within a primary region. In that primary region, you can make your data redundant by making sure that it's redundant locally. So each of or within your storage account, that data center has 3 different copies, at least within that. So in that case, you have LRS, which is locally redundant storage. Okay. So you have multiple servers on there that have a copy of your data. That's just for local redundancy. But if you want it to be redundant across availability zones, then you have what is known as ZRS or ZRS. ZRS, as you can see in this picture, you have a copy in one availability zone, you have another copy in the second availability zone, and a third copy in another availability zone. So in this case, you have 3 copies. Those 3 copies are redundant across availability zones. And they are redundant across availability zones, but all those availability zones are within one primary region. So that's all about your primary region redundancy. Now, the second option of redundancy is having it in a secondary region. That's, for instance, if something happens in the primary region, let's say a flood an earthquake or a catastrophe, then a backup copy resides in a secondary region. In that case, you have the first example on the top right, which is geo-redundant storage. Your primary region has its data center that has a local redundant storage, and then you have a copy or a replication of that same data that you stored in a secondary region. Okay, so it's geo-redundant. We've talked about locally redundant storage. We've talked about zone redundant storage. Now we're talking about geo-redundant storage, which is in a secondary location, a secondary region. In addition to that, instead of having just all the redundancy in a local center, you can decide to also implement a version of what we had earlier, the zone redundant storage, but also replicate it outside that region. So that's where you have geo zone redundant storage. Still a mouthful, right? So that's GZRS. All of these, normally you'll be able to access it if everything kaputs on the first region. You can go to the second region and just continue working like nothing happened. Or if everything kaputs in the second region, the secondary region, you can go back to your first region and still work peacefully without any interruption in your business, just like disaster recovery. But the third option is that you can have read access on both the primary and the secondary location simultaneously. That's where you have RA, geo redundant storage, or RA, geo zone redundant storage. So that's how we end up having 6 different types of redundancy types. So going back to the very first slide we touched on today, let me jump back to the beginning. Instead, we're going to talk about our goals, storage account options, storage types, redundancy options. So we've been able to address those 3 already. Let's go over it again. Storage account types, you can have your standard general purpose storage. Every different type of service can be deposited in there. And those services include Blob Storage, Queue Storage, Table Storage, Azure Files. All of them have these options of redundancy, which we just talked about. The local redundant storage, the geo-redundant storage, the read access geo-redundant storage, zone redundant storage, geo-zone redundant storage, and read access geo-zone redundant storage. It talks about the usage as well. Next up is the premium blocks. That's if you have only blobs that you're going to store. Okay, the next is file storage blobs. That's if you have only premium files or Azure files that you're going to store. For those two, you're either using locally redundant storage or zone redundant storage. All right, you don't need to replicate it across geographical areas. Finally, you have page blobs. Page blobs are only locally redundant. So that covers clearly now what we talked about of the 4 account types and the 6 redundancy options that we just discussed. Again, a storage endpoint similar to the endpoints we talked about yesterday with networking. You just have to be unique, just like your email address, and it's made up of your account name and the type of service. We've been talking services. We haven't touched any of the services yet. So let me jump in and we can talk about the services. Before I do that, does anyone have any questions, or should I say what questions you have? No questions. So ideally, a question that you might have would be you would like to store files of this type, and you like to store queues, you like to store this type of information. What type of account should you be able to store that in? If you have that type of question which is asking you that you need to store Azure files and page blobs, automatically you cannot use any of these because these are only unique for them. So you definitely need to use a standard general purpose V2, which we know standard general purpose V2 account type. You can dump everything in there, you should be just fine. So understand those differences. And if you're also asked, you need to be able to make sure that your storage is redundant in case there is a disaster in a particular region, then you should be looking at one of these secondary region redundancies, either geo redundant storage or geo zone redundant storage. If it specifies again in the question that you want the redundancy to be across availability zones, then it should be a geo zone redundant storage. And it depends to if they ask you if the read access should be enabled or it should not be enabled, then you'll be able to answer your question correctly. That is as easy as that. All right, let's jump in now to different types of storage services. Types of storage services, Again, as you can see, there's 5 major types, right? You have blobs. What is a blob? It's not a big word per se. Blob is a short form. You see that quite a bit, because in IT we're lazy, we don't need to reinvent anything. But blob stands for binary large objects, BLOB, binary large object. If you take all the initials, that's what it forms, BLO, and then another B, and S because it's plural. So what is a binary? A binary is either a 1 or a 0, right? Just like a decimal is 1 all the way, or 0 all the way to 9, all right? So binary is a language that computers understand. 1, if there's electricity going through the capacitor, or 0 if there's none. So whatever type of data you're going to use in IT, in computer science, in information systems, it's going to be either a 1 or a 0. So in a nutshell, it's telling you that you can store text, you can store any type of data, and it takes in massive, large amounts of data that you can use to the data lake or data lake storage generation 2 or version 2 to be able to utilize big data applications or analytics for whatever case. So if you're asked, you need to be able to store data that you need for big data analytics, then you definitely want to be using an Azure Blob Storage. Okay, so that's the biggest one that's more dynamic than the most. Otherwise, you can use Azure File Storage. File storage is just like the regular shared folders that we use at work or at home. If you have a folder where you can drop pictures, anyone that's using a computer can see it. Those are files that you're sharing. So file storage, again, is just having a cloud or on-premises file share system with queues. Queues, think about standing in line for service or standing in line to receive bread or to receive a particular service tickets, whatever. Just like a message, you send a text message, it goes in a queue to get delivered. So queues are used for messaging between applications. So you have an application that sends a message to another and so on and so forth. Azure Disk, again, the usage mostly for virtual machines. So think about the disk that you have on your physical machine. Azure Disks are also block level storage volumes. When you talk about volumes, like volumes of books, in this case, it's volumes of storage that are being used for Azure Virtual Machine, amongst other things. For Azure Tables, it's usually used for key value pairs. Okay, if you want to store stuff, think about a dictionary. A dictionary has a word and a definition. Okay, so you use the key to be able to find the value. But that's about it. But why do we need Azure Storage? Again, think about all those benefits of using the cloud. The benefits of Azure Storage would include durability and high availability. We keep talking about high availability. Hopefully, by the end of this week, everybody will be thinking about high availability, security, secure, scalability, management. Okay, all of this is managed for us. We don't have to make sure that there's a backup for us. We don't have to make sure that we delete this and so on and so forth. We just set it up right and we can use it. All right. Now, finally, we also have accessibility, even though it looks like I can't spell it correctly. So accessibility means you can access it anywhere on the internet. Remember, the cloud is built with the internet backbone. So you can access it not only on Azure network, as we talked about networks yesterday, you can access it anywhere that you have HTTP and so on and so forth. All right. Now let's dive into each one of these different services to discuss further. So Azure Blob Storage. Azure Blob Storage, we said, is a big one, right? It's an object storage solution. You can store, again, loads and loads of data just like that, and there should be no problem with that. It's good for text, it's good for binary, it's good for videos, it's good for pictures, it's good for audios, it's good for all of that. All kinds of data which is unstructured. And what that means is there's no restriction on the kind of data that you're going to save, all right? But why do we prefer using a blob than a disk? A blob is better because you don't have the programmers and the developers, they don't have to worry about managing the disk. For instance, you say, okay, reserve this space for that, reserve that space for that, and so on. But for a blob, again, think of a blob like some murky thing that you just mix up together. That's what it also signifies. But things are saved in their natural format, in their native format. You don't need to mix, you don't need to clean anything up or patch anything up. You just save it the way it is, all right? And what are some of the things that you can do about that? Or what are some of the use cases? You can use it to save pictures or PDFs or documents, whatever you need for your website. You can use that to save it so that you can serve that URL, that unified resource locator. All you need is HTTP. All you need is the protocol to point you to that particular storage, which again, we have already talked about the endpoints. If you have the endpoint, you use the browser, you get to your storage, you see what you stored, easy peasy, okay? And you can use it to also store files. If you want to have distributed access, you want access in different areas, you have access out of a particular region in different, should I say, continents or different locations. So even Netflix, yeah, Netflix uses that, and they all use that storage to be able to stream videos or stream audios. And the same movie I'm watching here, someone can be watching it in Australia, someone else is watching it in China, and so on and so forth, if they have access. All right. Also important for us to back up stuff, so we can use it for archiving purposes. If there's a disaster, we can use it to recover data that's being saved off somewhere else, and so on and so forth. And for those that do a lot of analysis, be it for machine learning or for Internet of Things, you can store it for data analysis. You analyze the data peacefully. But because of the size of the data, it becomes challenging when you talk about the cost. So managing the cost is very important. Managing the cost of this expanding storage needs to be taken very seriously. And how do we do that? For blob storage, you have different tiers of storage. Okay, if you know you're saving the data for backup purposes, you're never going to take a look at it except everything burns down in your own old location, then you might want to consider using the archive access tier. There, everything gets stored. It's rarely used. It gets stored for about 180 days at least before you can lose access of it. All right. Now, if you're going to use it infrequently, maybe you use it every now and then, you use it every month maybe, or every 2 weeks, then a cool access tier would be good because the data is saved in there for 30 days. But if it's something that you use very frequently, maybe a picture that goes on the website or whatever documents that have to go on the website, then you should consider saving it in the hot access tier. So those 3 tiers, depending on the frequency of use and the retention period that you want it, right? So I hope that is clear for Azure Blob Storage. The next type of service is Azure Files. Like I said, very similar to shared folders that we have in our businesses or shared folders that you have at home with pictures of family and so on and so forth. In this case, it's fully managed file shares. The only difference here, or where you get to pick, is how do you want it to be managed. Okay, we don't really need to know the workings, the inner workings of server message block, which is SMB, or network file system, which is NSF, NFS. Sorry, I have to say it backwards. All those protocols, depending on what operating system you're using. SMB works okay, just fine with Windows, Linux, Mac, but NFS does not work on Windows. If you need to use it on Windows, then you need to do what is known as a file sync, which we'll talk about shortly. But key benefits again of using Azure Files, we have that shared access, as you can see here. If you save your file on the cloud, you can access it on your laptop at home. You can access it at your main office. You can also access it at the different branches that you have out there. All they need to do is connect to the file share, or sorry, to the Azure file on the cloud, and everything is fine, rather than having everything located in your back end and so on and so forth. So that's going to be the primary challenge. Also, it's fully managed for you. Remember, it's platform as a service. So that's managed for you. You don't have to worry about the management of it. You don't have to worry about buying hardware to be able to save all that stuff on there. You can also use scripting and tools. We took a look at the web portal, the Azure portal. On the portal, you can go through the cloud shell to either use PowerShell or Bash to do back-end command line programming. So you can create files in the back end. You can write scripts you can create files programmatically. You can access them programmatically, and you can modify them programmatically as well. And also there's that resilience. Your file is always going to be there. If there's a catastrophe or a disaster, and everything should be fine. Next is familiar programmability. That's really not very critical for us now. But if you have developers that are working on their APIs, they're familiar with the system, the services. So whatever you do that works fine with Azure should work just fine with that as well. Now let's see. I think I'm skipping quite a bit here because we talked about Azure Files. We didn't talk about queues, disk, and tables. But there's no big deal for those. I'm going to talk about that after our break because our break is coming up. The 2 more things that are left that we didn't talk about are file movement and file migration. For file movement, again, copying files from one location to another, you can do that in 3 ways, right? We talked about managing everything on the cloud and in the cloud using the front end, which is the web portal, or the back end, which is a command line interface. So when we looked at PowerShell, I did mention to you that all the commands begin with AZ or AZ. So if you use the command line interface, you can use AZ copy to copy a file from one location to another. The only caveat is you're syncing these files in one direction. It's not in both directions. So you're copying from A to B or copying from B to A and not synchronizing them together. But if you're not a big fan of using black and white command line backend shell, then you can use Azure Store Explorer. When you hear the word Explorer, think about Internet Explorer. When you hear the word Explorer, think about Windows Explorer. When you get on your PC, if it's a Windows PC, you open Windows Explorer to be able to navigate from the C drive to the desktop, to your documents, to the downloads folder, and so on. So in this case as well, you have a graphical user interface, which is the opposite of the command line interface. So rather than back end, you have front end, because you can see all these buttons that you can touch, click and touch, or click and drag and drop, rather, click the buttons. It's all nice and fancy. But at the end of the day, it's using that same AZ copy in the back end. So it's just a standalone app or a standalone application or a standalone program that uses that back end technology. So if you're comfortable with the back end, might as well just use it. The third, which is really important, Azure File Sync, it's centralized. It helps you centralize your file shares. In this case, it synchronizes it both ways, okay? And it uses something that has already been used in our Windows environment, the Windows File Server, to be able to improve on in fact, you get the same flexibility, the same performance, and the same compatibility when you're moving files from one place to the other. All right. So a quick quote, since we're getting to the top of the hour. No, we're getting to break time. It's to remember, with the cloud, individuals and small businesses can snap their fingers and instantly set up enterprise class services. So you being able to understand all of these, as well as the security, identity, and access, which we'll talk about next week, the management of all of that, you'll be in a central role that, all these companies out there that are moving to the cloud, they're going to need your experience and expertise to be able to guide them to understand how to solve these problems. But before we get to Azure Solutions Architect, we need to be able to understand the fundamentals. Once we get these fundamentals, we get certified, we become administrators. You can administer all these files. You can understand the different services, be able to make sure that they are communicating using that network that we talked about earlier, and so on and so forth. Finally, there are going to be some challenges or some brilliant ideas in future that need to be implemented on the cloud with your company. You will be the SME, you'll be the subject matter expert that they'll come to be able to answer these questions. How can I make this secure? How can I expand this? Why is this not connecting to that? How do I grant this person access to this service? And then you should be able to do it with a snap, either by using the web portal or using PowerShell or Bash. All right. So a few things that we skipped. Like I said, we haven't talked about migration. When we come back after our break, I'm going to clarify the migration options that we have. It's just going to take us 5 to 10 minutes. We did talk about moving files, right, from using the backend AZ copy or using a standalone app with a GUI, graphical user interface, the Storage Explorer, or we can synchronize them using File Sync. We also did describe storage tiers, the hot tier, if you're using the data frequently, like a website. We talked about the cold tier, if you're using it infrequently, say accessed every 30 days or so, and also the archive tier. The archive tier, which is for data that can be stored for up to 180 days without use. And the different storage services, there's 4 or 5 depending on who you talk to, but definitely you have the blob storage, you have the queues, you have the file storage, you have the table storage, and the final one that I keep forgetting, which one did I forget? Blob, queues, tables, file storage, 4 of them. Yep, let me go back and make sure I did not miss any. Which one did I miss? Disk storage, oh my goodness, yes, disk storage is very important. Disk storage is used in like I mentioned earlier, virtual machines. We talked about virtual machines a couple of days ago or yesterday. So virtual machines use disk storage, definitely important, but it's not as flexible as the blobs. All right. So redundancy options, the 2 different types of redundancy options that we have is in the same primary region or primary and secondary region. In the primary region, you can have locally redundant storage, or you can have zone redundant storage, which is within availability zones. But when you have it across primary and secondary regions, you can have geo redundant storage or geo zone redundant storage. And depending on how you want to be able to access it, you can have read access geo redundant storage and read access geo zone redundant storage. And at the end of the day, or actually at the beginning, before you can start storing data, you need to have an account. Before you can start sending emails, you need to create an email address, an account with Google, Gmail, or Yahoo, or MSN, whichever one you're using. And we also talked about the different types. We have the general purpose type, which you can just dump in all those different storage services in there, or you can have the block type, or you can have the file type, or you can have the queue type, depending on the type of service that you're using. Sounds good? Okay, so yes, rounding off, we had a few things that we did not touch. What was it? Migration. So what is migration? How does that take place? So again, migration, just moving data from one location to another. There are two ways you can migrate data. In Azure, you can use Azure Migrate. Again, it's a service that's going to help you to migrate from on-premises to the cloud. Okay, so you're using functions as a hub to help you manage that. You know, you can either use a unified migration platform or a range of different tools. Obviously, we'll talk about some of them later on, and also assessment and migration. But like I said, you have a bunch of integrated tools that you can use. You can use Azure Migrate on a discovery and assessment, or Azure Migrate on a server migration, or you can use Data Migration Assistant. Again, all of that just helps you move data from on-premises to the environment on the cloud. Okay, so that's something that, I mean, if you're in the business of on-premises data usage, then you want to get to the cloud. You want to be able to support both real-time migration of infrastructure, not just the infrastructure. You can also migrate your applications or whatever data is being used. Now, Azure Data Box, which was the option. Let me get to that slide, actually. I think it was in the beginning. Nope. So forward. There you go. That's what I wanted to get to. So Azure Data Box is physical migration service. Okay, that's going to help you transfer large amounts of data, but it's inexpensive. It's also reliable, and it's very quick. Okay, so the secure data transfer is accelerated. You know, it's just shipping you a proprietary data box. So think about, say you're moving from one state to another, moving from one country to another. You get a box being shipped to you, put your stuff in there, send it out, and that data box is transported to and from your data center to regional carriers. Okay, obviously it's not physical per se, it's just your data that's being put in that box. So rugged case protects everything in there, and it secures it from transit in or secures it from damage in transit. So use cases would be, maybe you have a one-time migration. Okay, you want a large amount of on-premises data to be moved to Azure. You get this data box, package everything in there, ship it over. If you're moving, again, say a media library, okay, so from offline tapes, maybe you have a bunch of tapes that you have been saving and you want to move that data to the cloud. You know, all of that can be moved using data box. All right, so you create an online library. Say you had CDs or tapes or a bunch of media, videos, and so on. In this case, there was an old business, I think it was Blockbuster per se. You know, if they had a bunch of tapes that they were able to use, I think back in the days, you used to request CDs, DVDs to be mailed to you. You know, all those CDs, DVDs, they can all be sent that way. Also, you can migrate your virtual machines. Okay, so you have a virtual machine farm, or you have SQL Server, or you have applications. All of those can be put in the data box and migrated as well. Or if you're moving historical data, okay, obviously, depending on the institution, it could be military, it could be a bank, it could be other financial institutions, health institutions. You know, you want to be able to have all that historical data available for you. You can move that to get in-depth analysis and reporting using Hadoop Insight, right? So again, initial box transfer. If it's the first time that you're getting it done, your data box can be followed with incremental transfers over the network. So the first time you're moving to the cloud, you're migrating to the cloud, you get everything in the data box, get that is situated to kickstart the move or kickstart the migration. So in other cases, you might have periodic uploads. Let's say you want to move the data once a week, once a month, every weekend when it's not being used, and so on. So those are all different scenarios that you can use the data box to import data to Azure. But there are some cases too that you might need to export data from Azure. Okay, if you need to export data from Azure, let's say for instance, you've encountered disaster recovery. Okay, you had a business in Turkey, the earthquake unfortunately happened, all your business went down, you lost all your data in your data center, but luckily enough, you had a backup on Azure somewhere. You want to get back up to speed with your business, then you have to request a copy from Azure to be, or Microsoft per se, to be able to restore your on-premises network. So in that typical example of a disaster recovery, or maybe for security requirements, okay, when you need to be able to export data out of Azure due to government or security requirements for one reason or another. But then another example could be maybe things didn't work out for you, trying to use Azure services. Hopefully it does work out. But if you want to migrate back to on-premises or to another cloud provider, then you want to move back all your data from on-premises, you definitely can do that using the data box. So data box, again, you have these secure boxes where you move all your data physically, and that should be fine. Apart from that, the only other thing that we didn't really talk about was, let me move forward here, was the different storage types or storage services. So we did talk about queues, right? Queues are just message store. So if you're storing messages, a few things you need to remember, they have a cap, they have a maximum, okay, in terms of size. Each single message can have up to 64 megabytes of size, but you can have a bunch of those messages available to you, okay? You can have up to, I believe, millions of messages in the queue storage, okay? So it could be up to millions, like I said, but it's commonly used for a backlog. Maybe you can have a backlog of messages or things that need to be processed asynchronously, all right? But one thing we did talk about earlier with compute services was functions. We said when you hear the word serverless, it means functions. So when we talked of compute services, we talked about virtual machines, we talked about virtual desktops, we talked about containers. We didn't talk about Kubernetes. That's the one thing I skipped, but I'll find some time to talk about Kubernetes as well. But we said if you don't want to have to fire up your machine, your virtual machine, and so on, you can use functions, because functions send messages, or they wait for a message to signal you to fire up that machine. It runs for a second or so, and then it shuts it back down. So in this case, you can combine the compute functions, like the Azure functions, to take an action when a message like this Azure queues is received, all right? So for instance, you can perform an action if a customer uploads a form to your website. You could have the submit button on the website to maybe trigger a message to the queue storage. And then you could use your Azure functions to trigger an action. So that message was received, maybe a pop-up window to say, okay, your message was received, or maybe an email to be generated to send them a confirmation email, okay, we've saved this, and so on. And finally, we talk about disk storage. Again, it's just a block level storage for volumes that are managed by Azure. And again, you're mostly going to use it with virtual machines, not voice message, VM for virtual machines. So it's conceptually the same as your physical disk, but it's just a virtual version of it. And it gives you higher resiliency, as well as we always talk about high availability, right? That high availability is always there for us, all right? So that should take us then to the end of the road. We have covered everything we needed to cover for our storage. For our storage services. So as it says, describing Azure Storage Services, we've been able to compare the different storage types. We've also talked about storage tiers. We talked about redundancy options. We talked about the Azure Migrate, Azure Data Box. We talked about moving files by Azure Copy, Azure Storage Explorer, and File Sync. So I think we should be up to speed with our expectations so far on Azure Storage. Do we have any questions on that? No questions. So it's a pretty short class today. We've been able to achieve all of that. Tomorrow, well, not tomorrow, the next session, which will be on Saturday, will be on a little bit about security, right? So we'll talk about identity, access, and security. It's going to be a fun one. There's nothing that's going to be very technical in this class for next Saturday. So I'll expect you to review all the technicalities that we've talked about this couple sessions, and feel confident that we are going to be talking a lot about real world scenarios. I'll also take some time to do some demos for you, and then we'll get to do a lot more practice sessions as well. So I'll encourage you.